I'm a 23-year-old female, and I decided to give the dating app Hinge a try. I tried a few other apps before, but they didn't work well for me, so I created a profile and started browsing. Before I knew it, I was getting matches. One of them was Chris. He was a year older than me and had brown hair with a cool artistic style with thick glasses and a beard. We had a really nice chat one night, so we agreed to meet up face to face. We decided on a bar that I'd visited a few times with friends. It wasn't my top choice, but it seemed like a good spot for our first meeting. When I got to the bar, Chris was already waiting for me. We went inside, and surprisingly, we had a really good time. Chris seemed a bit shy, but it wasn't a big deal. I actually thought he was kind of cute. We grabbed some drinks and ended up talking for about 2 hours, really getting to know each other. Then, when our date ended, we said goodbye, and I went home. In the following weeks, Chris would text me every now and then, but it wasn't consistent. That made me feel unsure about where things were going. Eventually, I stopped responding altogether. I figured maybe he wasn't quite ready for a relationship like I was. I didn't feel bad about it then. A few weeks later, I was sitting at home feeling bored when I got a notification on my phone. It was Chris. Was surprised but kind of happy to hear from him. He asked if I wanted to hang out that night, and since I didn't have any plans, I said yes. This time I decided to give him my address so he could pick me up and we could spend some more time together. 30 minutes later, he arrived in front of my building. He drove a blue Honda Civic with a big dent in the back bumper. I hopped in, but something felt strange right away. As I mentioned, Chris was a bit awkward, but this time he barely spoke at all, so I instantly regretted getting into the car with him. I thought to myself, as soon as we stop, I'm out of here. This time we were headed to a different bar. When Chris parked the car, I came up with an excuse, pretending to receive an urgent call that required me to leave immediately. I could see doubt on Chris's face, but I didn't stick around to explain. I turned and walked away. On the bus, I blocked and deleted Chris from Hinge. I also blocked his number on my phone. He didn't do anything terrible, but something about him made me uncomfortable. It's hard to explain, but things just felt strange. However, if that was the end of it, this wouldn't be a scary story. In the following days, Chris sent me a friend request on Facebook and started following me on Instagram. I began to feel really creeped out, so I blocked him on both apps for a few days. Everything seemed fine, but then things got scary. I noticed his car parked on the street near my workplace and even close to my apartment building. The dent and the bumper made it easy to recognize. Weeks passed, and I'd catch glimpses of his car now and then, but I never spotted Chris himself. However, that would soon change. One evening, as I was walking home late from work, the sidewalk was dark. Suddenly, I felt a chill run down my spine. At that moment, I glanced across the street and spotted Chris's car. The night was silent, and the street was nearly deserted, which made me feel extremely vulnerable. Suddenly, I felt someone grab me from behind. A man's arm wrapped around me. It was Chris. We struggled for what felt like a long time, although it was probably only a few seconds. As soon as I realized I couldn't overpower him, I panicked and did the only thing I could think of. I screamed as loud as I could, and I didn't stop. Eventually, the noise must have attracted attention because a few people came out onto the street from one of the nearby apartment buildings. As soon as people came out, Chris ran away. Luckily, I had written down Chris's license plate number, so it wasn't hard for the police to find him. He's facing legal charges for what he did, and I was granted a restraining order to keep him away from me. There were a lot of red flags that something bad might happen with me, but I simply ignore them. Now I realize I should have called the police when I first noticed his car in my neighborhood. Signs like that shouldn't be ignored, and I nearly suffered a terrible consequence because of it. I hadn't used dating apps for a long time. To be honest, I didn't like them as I thought. It was tough to meet someone nice in bars and clubs, but then one day I thought, why not give it a shot? So I opened up Tinder and started swiping. That's when I stumbled upon Pat's profile. He seemed like a genuinely good guy. We chatted for a while, getting to know each other, and decided to meet up for a drink one evening. Then I told him where I lived, and he said he'd come by at about 7 o'clock, I dressed up in a pretty dress but felt nervous as I waited for him standing outside my apartment. I saw a shabby old truck pull up. I wasn't sure if it was him, but when it stopped in front of my building, I knew it was Pat. He was tall with short blonde hair and a scruffy beard. He wore a shirt with a crisscross pattern and jeans. He came over to me and gave me a big hug. I felt a bit awkward but also kind of happy. We got into his truck and he asked if I was hungry. I said yes. Then he said he knew a good place. It was a bit far from where we lived, but he said it would be nice. I hesitated for a moment, unsure about going, but he was so charming and convincing that I eventually agreed. As we drove out of town, leaving the familiar streets behind, I noticed the scenery gradually changing. Buildings became fewer and farther between, and the trees grew thicker. I started to feel a little worried because I had only met this guy recently. When we got to the bar, I noticed it wasn't like the places I usually go to. It was small, dimly lit, and it had weird smell. There were only a few other people there, and they all turned to stare at us as we walked in, making me feel even more uncomfortable. Pat ordered drinks for me, but I politely declined. He kept asking me to take the shot, and I finally said, "Hey." I figured maybe it would help me relax a little. As we sat there chatting, Pat seemed to only talk about himself. He went on about all the fights he'd been in and how he once heroically saved a kid from drowning. I tried my best to listen and nod along, but deep down I couldn't shake the feeling that he was exaggerating a lot. As the night wore on, I started to feel more and more scared. There was no cell service, and I was in the middle nowhere with a guy I barely knew. Pat kept insisting I drink more, but each sip made me feel sicker. So after a while I told him I wanted to leave, but he brushed off and refused to take me home. He said we were having a good time and I shouldn't spoil it. But deep down, I knew I couldn't stay any longer. I felt really uneasy and just wanted to leave, so I made up an excuse, telling him I needed to get home. I mentioned an early morning meeting and the need to rest. He seemed hesitant at first, but after some convincing, he agreed to take me back to my apartment. As we drove back, a sense of relief washed over me, but it turned to fear as Pat's mood shifted. He started to get angry, accusing me of wasting his time and saying he'd driven me for nothing. My heart raced as he angrily pulled over to the side of the road. Then, with a stern look, he turned to me and said, "Just get out then. I'm not taking you any further." I got out of the truck and started walking down the road, my heart pounding with fear. I didn't know where I was headed, but I knew I had